You're listening to Aging Today, the podcast where together we explore the options to aging on your terms.
When I get older, losing my hair, many years from now, will you still be sending me a Valentine? Birthday greetings, bottle of wine. If I've been out till 2:45, would you lock the door? Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64?
And now the podcast where together we discuss proactive aging on your terms, connecting to the professional advice of our special guests while creating better days throughout the aging process. Now here's your host, Mark Turnbull.
Welcome to Aging Today. We are the podcast where together we do explore the many options to aging on your terms. You can find Aging Today at our 4 years of any of our past programs on our website. All you have to do is go to agingtoday.us. That's www.agingtoday.us. And you can also follow us on any of your favorite podcast channels. We are on Spotify, Pandora, Apple Podcast, iHeart, Spreaker, and many others. All you got to do is follow us, and you can pick up the library of past shows there as well. And then finally, for all of you that are our listening audience, this show exists for you. This is about the aging process, and we try to cover all the implications and the aspects to aging, aging in place, aging in the right place, and we want to answer all your questions about aging. So we want to hear from you. Ask your questions, and if you have ideas for topics or guests to be on Aging Today, reach out to me. All you got to do is contact me, your host, Mark Turnbull. And my email address is mark@agingtoday.us. That is mark@agingtoday.us. Well, each week we have a very special show, and this is no different than any other week. It's a very special show. It's a topic that I think we can all relate to. We all have known somebody that has been touched by behaviors in the past that tend to want to strain relationships. And in fact, my wife and I, when we had our 3 children, we began to sit down and we began to think about what kind of a legacy do we want to pass on to our children. We have 3 boys, Austin, Taylor, and Kylan. You've heard me talk about them in the past. And one of the things that the legacy that we passed on to them is that we wanted them to know that what life is all about. Life is about relationships. It's that clear. It's that simple. Think about it. Everything that you and I do revolves around relationships. And then we taught our sons that the 3 main tenets of any relationship is learning how to love, respect, and protect one another. And it's not always easy to love the unlovable. It's not always easy to respect those that don't respect you. And it's not going to always be easy for you to be a protector of those, and especially those that don't want to be protected. But that's our challenge as human beings as we traverse this earth, and it's a very interesting challenge, and we're successful at it sometimes, but more than not, I think we're all challenged by it, and it's something that is very hard to live up to. But we set that as the example, we set that as the goal in front of us, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, relationships, past relationships, and how those past relationships have an impact upon us. And here to tell her story is an amazing author, amazing writer. You've probably read some of her work in the past. She's a very gifted writer, but today we're going to be talking about a brand new book that is just recently released just yesterday, in fact. It is called The Burning Light of Two Stars. It's a mother-daughter story. And this show is about stories, telling your story. And here to tell her story is Laura Davis. Laura, welcome to Aging Today.
I'm so pleased to be here. It's great to be with you, Mark.
Yeah, I'm very excited to. I did have the privilege of reading your book, and I know my listening audience is going to really enjoy your story. And I just want, and I know our listening audience that have been with us for the past 4 years, we talk about story all the time. In fact, we've often said in the past that our lives are all a story inside of a bigger story. And there's a couple of things that story does for us. It nourishes us, and it also sheds light on our lives. Those are the two main tenets that we talk about with stories. And as I was reading your book, it had that kind of an impact on me. It nourished me, and it also shed some light on me and my life and relationships that have gone sour in the past. But we're going to talk about your particular book, The Burning Light of Two Stars. This is the story about your mother and yourself. And so I guess to start out with, before we get into the book, what I really want our listening audience is to get a glimpse into your past, into who you are and how you became a writer.
Well, I have been, I guess you could say, obsessed with words my whole life and with stories. And I have used writing as a tool probably ever since I could hold one of those big fat blue pencils that they gave me in first or second grade. And I've used writing and stories, like you're saying, as a way to understand myself, as a way to find clarity, as a way to express what was on my heart, as a way to solve problems, to troubleshoot, to brainstorm. And starting when I was a teenager, I also began to have a public life with books. I started doing things publicly with my writing, in my high school literary magazine. And I was a journalist for a while. I've been a blogger and a podcaster. And I have done, this is my 7th book. So writing has been a huge part of my life. And I love to use writing as a way to educate, to entertain, to inform. When I was younger, I used to love to use writing to shock people, to try to change their minds. I don't really feel I'm capable of doing that anymore.
Yeah.
I've become more humble, but
isn't that interesting?
Storytelling has always, really
I find that I'm the same age, I think, as you are. If I remember in your book, you were born in 56, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and I was born in 57. So we're of the same age, same time frame. And as I was reading your book, I was just like fascinated. I was like, oh my goodness. She was at the place that all of us from that era had wanted to be. And I'm going to let you tell that story a little bit later. But yeah, I'm totally with you. And I think maybe that's why I resonated so well with your book, is that we grew up in the same kind of a time frame and same kind of culture.
Yeah, it definitely was a very unique time when everything was up for question. And I think for me, it led me on a trajectory that was not traditional. I have not had a traditional life. And I think there was a lot of permission at that time to explore, to experiment, to rebel. Mm-hmm. And I certainly was one of those people rebelling.
And you had the parents, in some ways, the perfect scenario for that rebellion to flourish in some respects.
Yeah, my parents are pretty amazing people, and in many ways, wonderful parents. In other ways, not so wonderful. Mm-hmm. But they really gave me this grounding in creativity, which I think has really fed me my whole life. My mother was an actor, so I grew up around the theater. My father was a music teacher, so I grew up with there was a piano in our living room with 20 different instruments underneath it. There was always music in my household, and my parents were both good writers, and there's a lot of storytelling. Mm-hmm. So I think, and a lot of reading. So I think words were really focused on when I was growing up, and that was really enriching. And my father ended up, he was a dropout. He was a music teacher when I was growing up, and I was about 13, 14. He left our family in New Jersey, and he moved out to California and became a hippie. So I had this kind of, and at the time, even though he was the one who abandoned me, I really idolized him, which I think is pretty typical in a divorce scenario.
Yeah.
I just thought he was the coolest father that I could possibly have. I began to assess him a little differently as I got older, when I realized what he had left my mother to deal with, and how he had just walked out on all his responsibilities. But from him, I got a lot of permission to look at life in a very different kind of way.
Yeah. And as you read through the book, and if you grew up in that era, you start to think of the openness of our society, and there was a lot of questioning going on. There was a lot of change culturally, not so closed, and there was much more freedom to think and to be different. And it was really cool the way you wrote about your dad, and all of a sudden he just uproots himself and he moves to California to be a hippie, and that was, I could really resonate with that particular story, because there was I was around a lot of hippies when I was growing up as well. And very exciting times when you're forming all of your opinions about the world, and on it goes.
I think for me, one of the most relevant aspects of the parenting I had was that my parents responded to me very differently. My father, despite the fact that he left and, uprooted himself and abandoned his responsibilities, my whole life, until he died, he always was really a supporter of me. He was in my camp. He believed in me. When I was 23, I came out as a lesbian. He was super supportive. Whatever choices I made, I always felt like he had my back. And my mother, on the other hand, had a lot more need for me to fulfill her dreams that she had for me. And when I began to deviate from the daughter she wanted, we really started getting into some pretty intense conflict, starting when I was a teenager. And it just escalated and escalated to the point of becoming completely estranged. And so, I had one parent I felt like who was really supporting me, and the other one who saw all my choices as something I was doing specifically to hurt her or to undermine her. She was always the center of the story. Mm-hmm. And so she was in some ways incredibly loyal to me, but I found her a very difficult person to love, despite my underlying hunger to really have a connection with her.
I think of my parents and in the roles that parents play in our lives, and both of your parents were creatives, at least what I would call creatives, music and the theater. You'd have to be creative people, wouldn't you say?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and as I was reading about your parents, it was really interesting. Your mom being a creative person, she was really the one that was the conservative of the two parents, whereas your dad was more of about chaos. Your mom was more about order, and that was
control. I would say control. My mother was more about control. My father was all about freedom.
Yeah.
That was his watchword, freedom.
Yeah, but the yin and the yang, the interaction between those two. And your parents were kind of the epitome of that, at least as I was reading your book, and that's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, there's a really interesting conversation I had with my brother. I had one brother, and when I was in my early 30s, and my mother and I were at the height of our estrangement, and really not speaking to each other, and I was hating her. That was the lens I was seeing her through, and I don't know what she felt about me, probably that I was a horrible daughter. And we were just really at loggerheads with each other. And I remember my brother and I went hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park. He was living in Colorado. I was visiting him. And we had this conversation, and I said to him, when mom gets old, there is no way I could take care of her. So why don't you take mom and I'll take dad? And because they were divorced, and
Yeah.
this was the conversation. And my brother agreed. Okay, so when my father got older and he began to fail, he had heart failure over a number of years. I was the child, the daughter, who took care of him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And saw him all the way through his death.
Yeah.
And then when this story opens, one of the very first scenes in this story is my mother's almost 80 years old. She's living in New Jersey, where I grew up. I'm living in California, where I had, in some ways, moved to get as far away from her as I could, and then stayed for 40 years. We were 3,000 miles away, and she calls me and says, announces she's moving to my town for the rest of her life. And so suddenly, here I was in this position that this agreement I had made with my brother, suddenly she's telling me that I'm the one that she wants to rely on. And then I have to face that situation and make a decision about what am I going to do? And despite the fact that we have this very difficult history, am I going to be able to show up for my mother for the rest of her life? And I think there are millions of people facing that kind of situation. I think it's hard enough to care for a parent under the best of circumstances. I mean, when the relationship is good, there are so many challenges in being a caregiver. But when there's a sense that the parent has betrayed you in some way in the past, and in my story, it's pretty severe what happened. But even in a situation that is not as serious, when there's a big unresolved relationship, and then you're faced with a person, a parent failing or a parent declining, a parent needing to lean on you, it can be a very challenging and stressful situation. And that's really the story I tell is, what did it take for me to show up for her? What changes did I have to go through? What did I have to face about our past? And, was I going to be able to show up the way I wanted to? And it required a whole level of maturity in me that I didn't really know if I had it or not. And that's the story that I wanted to tell is, how do you face that kind of situation? And is it possible to still heal a relationship, at the end of one person's, even if you've never really been able to achieve that before?
Yeah. The other thing that struck me as I was reading your story is the risk that you took to write the story. Because it wasn't, a story through, a rosy, it wasn't a rosy picture of the relationship between you and your mom and your family. And you must have thought twice about, going public and writing this story and the risk that you took. Talk a little bit about that.
I mean, I thought about it hundreds of times. It took me 10 years to finish writing The Burning Light of Two Stars. And there were a number of reasons. One is, I've been a writing teacher for 25 years, so I really know a lot about writing. But in this situation, all the books I've written before had been kind of nonfiction, information, how-to kind of books. Mm-hmm. And this was a memoir, and it was I had to learn a lot about storytelling that I didn't know. So I wasn't sure I had the writing chops. And actually, I had to learn a tremendous amount about my own craft to be able to pull off the story, create the momentum to keep people turning pages, to know how to tell it. So that was a huge issue. I worried about my memory, because in a memoir, it's based on what you remember. And I think of myself as someone who has a really crappy memory. So I had to deal with that. And the third thing, like you're saying, was, what was my family going to say? The book includes my spouse, Karen, who I've been with for over 30 years. It includes my 3 children, and my brother are all characters, and they all signed off on it. They were supportive of this project from the beginning, and I had them, read it towards the end, and they made some suggestions which I took. And I wanted to be sure that there was nothing in there that they really felt they couldn't live with.
And those are the living characters. Now, the characters...
Those are the living characters.
Of the story. And the story is primarily about you and your mom, who has since passed.
Right, and
your dad.
Yeah, I waited.
And your grandfather.
My dad, yeah. Yes, and they all have passed, and I didn't feel any... one of the base issues in this story is that I was sexually abused by my grandfather. I didn't feel he died decades ago, and I didn't feel any need to protect him from his own actions. And I've already written about him in the past. So, and my mother, I've written about her a lot. And I tell the story in the book about another book that includes her, where what it took for me to get her permission. But I actually, even though I was writing the book over the years that she was living here and gradually declining, I didn't really consider publishing it until she died. And while I was writing it, I just said to myself, I need to tell this story. I need to get it out. This is how I process things. I think it's a really powerful story, but I don't have to publish it. And in a way, I was creating just a little bubble of protection around myself, because if I started thinking about my other relatives, my extended family, I would just panic and shut down. And really, my concern was a little small pod of relatives of mine. They're not the people who are actually, they're not my immediate family. They're not in the book, but we shared the same grandfather. And when I published my first book, The Courage to Heal, which came out in 1988, I ended up estranged from that whole side of the family, because I was writing about, in part, the incest with my grandfather. And they were horrified. They were certain I was making it up.
And
they
in
wanted
denial.
me to recant. And in denial. And I really wanted their validation. And so, for years, I was estranged from my mother's whole side of the family. And, it took decades. I gradually began to rebuild those relationships over many, many years. And now at this point have, I wouldn't say intimate connections with them, but cordial. We could be at a holiday event together or something like that. And I knew that in publishing this book and bringing all those issues out that I had written about 30 plus years ago, and again, bringing them out into the public, that I really risked losing that same group of people again. It's probably maybe 10 people. And I'm not even particularly close to them, but I care about them. And I'm at a point in my life that it doesn't matter if I'm telling the truth and they're in denial. I don't care. I care about the fact that I'm choosing to do something. I'm choosing to be public about something that will hurt people whose lives are basically private. So even though ultimately I did decide to go ahead, and then I wrote to all my relatives and basically said, this is what I'm going to do, and apologized to them, about how difficult it is to have a writer in the family. But so there's a certain amount of sadness I feel in moving forward, because I know that no matter how many, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people this story touches, there's going to be a small little pot of people I care about who are going to experience some stress because of it. It's a very challenging thing, I think, for so many writers, even once we're writing fiction, because fiction is often based on real situations and real people.
Somebody's reality. And it's a story of sacrifice, and in some ways, and a story of salvation or reconciliation. As I was reading it, that's how I read it. I mean, as a writer, you're exposing, all the negatives of some of the negatives of your family and the relationship to your mom, and the risk that you took to write about that, and that's the sacrifice. And yet, on the other hand, on the other side, it's the salvation or the reconciliation which led to the salvation that helps so many readers like myself, or anybody that has gone through a relationship, and which we all have. If you're a human and you've been on this earth for a period of time, you've got relationships that are estranged.
Yes.
I mean, that's, and is that kind of how you see it as well, or am I on another path?
No, I mean, I maybe there are some people who are lucky enough not to be in that situation, but I think it's very, very, very common. And I think if you look at our world situation right now, and you look at the kind of polarization that is existing everywhere in the United States and actually all over the world, I think in some ways these kind of rifts are getting worse. And I think there are many people out there who are listening today who are really aching for
Yeah.
someone that they feel distant from that they still love.
Yeah.
But there are beliefs, or there's a fight, or there's something that happened, or there's just kind of a horror at what each other believes that is in the way. And I think it's challenging so many people right now. And what I was able to achieve with my mother over the course of this book starts with my birth and ends with her death, so it covers a 57-year span. We were able to. This is not like, as you said, it's not a rosy. This is not like take out the violins and everything is perfect. It's a very gritty and realistic story of what it takes to learn how to love someone who has betrayed you. And it's not perfect. And it took the two of us many, many, many years, and both of us really wanting to reconnect, to begin to heal that rift. And it wasn't a perfect healing. In the front, I've spent a lot of time with my publisher working on the cover of the book. And in the cover, there's a crack all the way through the cover, and it's filled with gold.
Mm-hmm.
And it's based on kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of taking pottery that's broken and then filling those cracks with gold to create something beautiful out of something that's been broken. And that's very much how I see this relationship I had with my mother. And I had to let go of being right. I had to look at her from a much broader perspective than just she's my mother and she hurt me in this way and that way and this way. I really had to get to the place where I could see her entire life, how she had been raised, the culture she grew up in, the generations of my family through time, and the legacy that was passed down through the generations. And it's sort of like going up in a spaceship or something, and you just keep seeing things from a broader perspective. There's an epigraph I put in the book that I love. It was a former writing student of mine. She said, every time I look in the past, every time I look in the rear view mirror, the past has changed. And that's how I see this relationship with my mother. I every time I look at it, 10 years later, another 10 years later, 5 years later, I see it differently. And I think were I to tell this story in 10 more years, I would probably write a very different book. Mm-hmm. But I think that kind of perspective of how our own relationship to our history keeps changing, I think is what enables us to heal relationships. Because something that was like a hurt that was so much in the foreground when it happened, when enough time has gone by, it recedes into the background and other things take precedent. And I think that kind of maturity, that kind of history, that kind of healing is what makes reconciliation possible.
How much of the story, when you, as you were describing what you just described, that history changes, and it's when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. I mean, that's essentially what you're saying. And how much of that story that you've written about the rift or the estranged relationship with your mom, and how much of this story is a story about Laura?
Well, it is a memoir, so it's really a story about me. I mean, I am the protagonist, but I always saw it as the story of a relationship. And, when I was, one of the biggest challenges when you're writing a memoir is what do you leave in and what do you keep in? And what do you take out? Because you can't write about your whole life. And so as I was making those choices, having hundreds and hundreds of pages I had written in the early drafts, I looked for things that really pertain to the timeline of my relationship with my mother. So I sat down one day and I made a list of what were all the major turning points in my relationship with her, from my birth to her death. What were the moments where things changed? Because that's what creates drama in a story. And I looked at those, and then those were the very first scenes that I wrote. And they provided really the backbone for the rest of the story. And there were lots of other really great stories I wrote. Maybe they were really funny or entertaining, but they were tangential. to this core story I wanted to tell, which is the story of this relationship.
Yeah.
And it required, although I'm the protagonist, something that was super important to me was I made use of something in the trade they call beta readers. And that means basically getting early readers to read drafts of your book before it's published. And I probably had maybe 120 or 130 people read this book before it was published over a course of years, at different times. And one of the questions I always asked is, how does the mother character come across? And how does the Laura character, me, come across? And in the early drafts, people would say, well, your mother, I really hated her, she just was horrible, and basically she was the villain and I was the hero. And I knew I was really far from being finished when I got that feedback, because I really wanted to create two characters who were human, who were flawed, and I didn't want to hide my own flaws, and so that's what I worked on. And when I got to the last set of readers, and I asked that question, people said things like, well, on this page, I couldn't stand your mother and I just loved you. And then when I turned the page, I couldn't stand you and I just loved your mother.
And I was doing the same thing.
Succeeded.
Yeah, I was doing that. And every great story has a hero, a villain, and a guide. And so now that you've written the book, how do you see yourself? Which of the characters do you fall into? Because you kind of are alluding to it there, and I think this is important.
Yeah, I don't know that that's a really great question, Mark. I don't know that I see it being so set. I'm the hero of my own story. That for me, this is a story about someone who is whose heart has been broken and has been shut down for really good reason. In my case, some early trauma and other things, which are part of the story. And the journey for the protagonist is, can she open her heart? Can a heart that has been closed for good reason learn to open again? And so, yeah, I was the hero of that story. But, as I was going through this book, and especially when I recorded the audiobook, and it was a really interesting process because in recording the audiobook, I heard my own book in a totally different way, even though I'd written every word. And there were certain scenes where I was just horrified at my own behavior. It was like, oh my God, I was really a tough daughter. So, then I was maybe the antagonist at those moments.
Sure. Yeah. No.
I don't know. How would you, I want to know what you would say. How would you answer that question?
Well, just from what I've read, and our conversation so far, you were the hero, and the guide. You were trying to figure out, as any hero does. I mean, go back to Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. He doesn't have the confidence to defeat his villain, which was Darth Vader. So he went to the guide, Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? And in your story, you're telling the story of an estranged relationship, and in the end it was all reconciled, and that brought peace, and so the antagonist, the villain, great question. I would say I don't really see the villain as your mom, but maybe in your story the villain was your mom, and there was other villains too. There was your grandfather. The guide. I thought the guide in your story was your dad.
Interesting.
The way you wrote it. I mean, even though it was really weird because he left you, and yet I saw him as your rock. You kept going back to him.
Interesting, because I ended up cutting so much of him. At one point, this manuscript weighed in at 140,000 words. I had to cut 50,000 words from it, and a lot of the stories about him.
I would have loved if you had talked more about your dad. He seemed like a very interesting guy. And I think you really resonated towards him. You missed out. I think there was something where you really missed not having a stronger bond between you and your dad?
Yeah, I think we had a pretty strong bond, actually.
Yeah.
But, yeah, maybe I'll have to write something else about him.
Oh, I'd love to hear. and tell our listening audience. This is the fascinating part. Okay, so there was an event in history back in the 60s, Woodstock, and you were there. Oh my goodness.
With my parents.
With your parents.
Right.
Oh, that's phenomenal.
It's interesting. In one of my drawers, in my my shirt drawer, at the very bottom, folded underneath all my shirts, is an original Woodstock T-shirt. That I when my dad died, I found it in his things, and I kept it.
Oh man,
and
hang on to that.
It's his shirt from Woodstock. Unfortunately it's a small. It'll never fit me, but
yeah.
I should probably frame it. But yeah,
I would frame
I was
that.
There.
Yeah, frame that for sure. Is there any did you listen to Janis Joplin? I think that you said something about her.
I did. I heard Janis Joplin. I heard Jimi Hendrix play the Sunrise. I heard Sly and the Family Stone.
And this was at the age of 12, right? You were 12 years of age?
13. I was 13 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, it wasn't, for me, it was actually a pretty confusing experience.
I can imagine.
And my parents both went. My mother was mortified, but it was all my dad's idea, of course. And she went along, and after the first night, she was just so horrified. She went back to this campground where we were staying, and she didn't come back. And my dad and I went the next night, and we spent the whole night there in the rain. And my dad, he was getting stoned, and he was part of the whole scene, and I was just kind of embarrassed.
Yeah.
But, I got so much mileage my whole life out of saying I was at Woodstock. And my mother, who hated the whole thing, she did too. She loved being able to say she was at Woodstock. So we all benefited from the panache of the experience.
Yeah. What a great story. So tell our listening audience, let's get into the book a little bit, without revealing too much, because we want our listening audience to pick it up, because it really is this good. So you guys got to pick this up. Where did it start? How did the relationship, when did it begin to sour? When did you begin to question?
I would say, probably when I was a little girl, I think my mother and I were close in some ways. Although, when I was sexually abused by my grandfather, I was started when I was 3 years old. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell her. I probably had no language for it. And so I didn't feel I could say anything. But I think our relationship began to sour probably as maybe pre-adolescent, as soon as I started to exert my own individuality. I think that's what was problematic. As long as I was the good little girl that she wanted, that she could be proud of, that, reflected well on her, all was good. But I have a very strong personality. It's the title of the book, The Burning Light of Two Stars, is really because there were these two powerhouses of energy butting up against each other. So as soon as I started to assert my own individuality, I think, and I think a lot of it happened around the time my dad left and I started becoming more rebellious, and my mother was grieving, because her whole life had blown up. And I think during that teenage time where, a lot of parents, and I've raised 3 teenagers, so I know, a lot of conflicts arise, but ours were more, more than just typical parent-child adolescent conflict. I always said it was our conflict was primal, because I had to pry myself away from her to become myself, because, me having an individuality was not allowed. So, I had to rebel much more strongly. And, because of the times we were talking about, the era in which I grew up, I ended up joining an ashram and having a guru. And, I did a lot of pretty wild things. I quit college 3 times. Everything she wanted for me, I did not do.
Well, you defied what I was describing earlier. Your mom represented order. Your dad represented chaos, freedom.
Yeah.
And you were not fitting into her order. And so that set off a chain of events in your relationship. Am I correct?
And she, there were just a lot of moments between us that just kind of put chinks in the relationship. And I kept moving further and further away from her because I felt like I had to in order to establish myself. And I had a very strong, compelling need to become who I was meant to be, and I feel like I have become that person. But in my instance, I couldn't really do it in her presence. I had to do it far away from her. And, when I revealed the sexual abuse to her, which didn't happen until I was 27 years old or 28, I think I just turned 28. That was really the final rift of like what had already been a pretty difficult relationship already. And she just could not handle the fact that this was her father who had done this to me. She was, now I would say she wasn't capable of believing it. At the time I just felt so betrayed because I needed her the most. It was the worst time in my life and she abandoned me. And, but now I would say in some ways, she gave me the strength to face that abuse and many other things in my life. And I really credit her and my dad, too, with giving me a lot of inner strength. But she didn't have the same capacity that I did. So it was kind of ironic in a way because I feel like I was capable of finding the courage to face that abuse and to heal from it, in part because of what she gave me, even though she wasn't capable of facing it herself.
Yeah. Reflecting back on, I'm a family of 5 children with my mom and dad. They're still alive. They're 91 years of age. And we just spent the weekend with them at the Oregon coast. And my sister, poor girl, one of four brothers. So she was well protected, but at the same time, I can't even imagine growing up with 4 brothers, being a young girl. But anyhow, she survived. But there was a rift and a conflict between her and my mom, and I've since observed that is a pretty common thing between mothers and daughters. Have you found the same thing, or am I?
Yeah, I think there's often a very complex web in a mother-daughter relationship.
Yeah,
and it could lean in one direction or the other, and I think it's really common.
And they're best of friends now. So it all ended well, just like your story as well. So, but you in the book, there's the story of 2 souls who just wouldn't quit each other. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, what it means is that even though my mother and I had really every reason to never speak to each other again, inside each of us, separate from each other, there was such a intense drive and desire to connect with each other. So it's at one point I describe it as like a beekeeper. Like I would, even though I felt hurt by her over and over again, I would keep reaching out to her. I would keep trying. And she kept trying too. And so I think we both had courage, a lot of courage and a lot of drive, and that we both were really determined to find a way past this huge elephant in the room, this one issue that we just were never going to see eye to eye on. And in part, one of the things my mother did, which I thought I give her so much credit for, is that, as I said, I had moved all the way across the country in part to get away from her because our relationship worked with a big buffer between us. So, we wrote really nice letters to each other. This was, in the era before the internet when people still wrote letters. There's this incredible cache of correspondence between us, which is one of the threads in this story. We wrote letters to each other, and from a distance on the phone and things, we could have like a pretty good relationship. But whenever we got together in person, it would be incredibly difficult. Like there might be a little honeymoon period where things would go well between us, but then, within 24 hours, it would fall apart, and I would be, hiding in her walk-in closet, cursing these non-refundable tickets that I had. I just wanted to get the hell out. So when I was in my 30s, mid-30s, I gave birth to my first son when I was 36 years old. And when I got pregnant, I think I really wanted her to be a grandmother to this child because I have a niece who's older than my kids, and I saw that she had been a really good grandmother to Sonia, and she really, really wanted a relationship with this child that Karen and I were going to have. And I think that motivated us a lot to try harder at our reconciliation. And in part, we did it by agreeing to disagree. That I got to the point where I had healed enough from the trauma in my childhood that it was no longer center stage in my life. It was there, but it had receded into the background. I was focused on my life moving forward.
You're listening to Aging Today with Mark Turnbull and his guest Laura Davis, author of The Burning Light of Two Stars, a daughter's account of an estranged relationship with her mother and reconciliation when caregiving for her aging parent was necessary. We'll hear more of Laura's story in a moment, right here on Aging Today.
Sometimes I'd like to smack old age right in the kisser.
Oh yeah, still got those moves.
I will be fabulous.
Comfort Care can help with as much or as little home care as you need. From medication reminders and meal prep to everyday chores and errands. Let us create your personalized care plan and find the perfect caregiver match so you can live your best life possible.
Call Comfort Care at 503-636-0417.
A Did You Know moment from Comfort Care Home Care of West Lynn.
Did you know story is the language of the heart? Our lives are all a story inside of a bigger story. As American professor Joseph Campbell, who passed away in 1987, one of the world's leaders in comparative mythology and comparative religion, said, "Everything starts with a story." Stories nourish us. Stories shed light on our lives. We learn our most important lessons through story, and story deepens them. Story tells us who we are, why we are here, what we are to do. Story gives us our best answers to all of life's big questions, and to the small ones as well. If you want to get to know someone, you need to know their story. If you want to know more about the power of story, or want to share your story, please call Comfort Care Home Care of West Lynn at 503-636-0417.
Now, more with Mark Turnbull and his guest Laura Davis, author of The Burning Light of Two Stars, on Aging Today.
She no longer needed me to recant and say it hadn't happened. And I think we stopped trying to convince each other, and we started to focus on other aspects of our relationship. Like, we really liked to cook together. We both loved going to the theater. I mean, just simple things.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things she said to me is, she said she was retired at that point. She had been a school social worker, and she had spent a lot of her winters for a number of years going down to San Miguel de Allende in Mexico and being a snowbird and getting out of the New Jersey winters. And when my son was maybe 2 years old, so this would have been like 26 years ago because he's 28 now, she called and she said she wanted to come to my town of Santa Cruz for the winter. She wanted to come rent her own place for 2 or 3 months. And she said, if we don't start spending time together and creating new experiences, all we'll ever have is a terrible past. And, on one hand, I knew she was right, but at first I was not very welcoming. I kind of begrudgingly said, okay. But I was very, very ambivalent about the whole thing. I had moved away from her for good reason. So she came that winter, and I didn't help her. I didn't help her find a place to live. I just was not very welcoming at all. And yet, when she was there, we would go to the movies, or I would invite her over for dinner, or she would come for Eli's birthday. And then she started coming every winter. And during those winter visits, there were quite a few of them. I think it went on for 9 years. We would have a lot of big fights, where we would both retreat into our corners. But then we would always come back and try. And during that time, we started to gradually build a new basis for connecting. So I thought her wisdom about geography was really incredibly good. And I think it really made a really huge difference in our capacity to gradually work our way back into each other's lives.
How similar were you to your mom?
Well, I think I'm a very driven person. And absolutely, I got that from her.
She was driven. Yeah.
Totally driven. I mean, she was way busier than I am, but I mean, she had like 3 calendars and she was involved in, 10 activities at the same time. And she would double, she was more so than me, but she had a very strong drive. And so do I. So I think that my kind of wiring in terms of, it's not natural for me to just like kick back and relax. I have to work at it. That came from my mom. I think we both enjoy entertaining and having people for dinner and making a really nice table. There are a lot of things. I love theater. I love storytelling.
You guys,
there's a lot of things.
As I was reading your story, I was going, you two are so similar, and yet there's so much conflict. And the reason why I bring that up is because my oldest son and I are very similar. He's gay, and not that matters, but I'm just saying that there's a bridge there. There's a similarity between the two relationships, between him and me and you and your mom, and yet there was a lot of conflict, a lot of sparks flying. Why is that? I mean, this is a chance for me to learn something about me and my son.
I don't know if it has anything to do with being similar. I think in my case, a lot of the conflict is because my mother was someone who needed to be center stage. I mean, she was an actor.
Yeah. He was
too.
She
won a beauty contest.
That's my son. He was an actor. He wanted to be an actor. He was an aspiring actor. In fact, we went, Tommy Lee Jones, they made a movie here in Portland, about the bridges, or I don't remember what it was about. But so we took him to audition, and I was standing in line waiting for breakfast, and the producers or whoever, the talent agency, came up to me and said, "Are you a cop?" And I go, "No." And I said, "Would you like to play one in the movie?" And I said, "Not really." But they finally corralled me in, and I got into a scene and my son didn't. And that did not set well. And I look back at that and I wish I had not done that at all, because I upstaged my son.
Yeah.
And looking back,
I think children should upstage their parents. I mean, honestly, I have 3 kids, and I want them to shine more than I do. And
me too.
Yet I'm not. I've tried to avoid the mistakes that I feel my mother made with my kids, and I think I have avoided some of the biggest ones. I probably have made other ones I'm still not even aware of, because that's the nature of there being a gap between generations.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we had a lot in common, but she couldn't bear for me. Like, whenever I look at photos of the two of us, including the photo that's on the front of the book, she's always upstaging me. She's always like pushing her way in the front, and her smile is really big, and I'm usually looking surly in the background. So
my son would say the same about me. Our stories are very similar. Yeah, in some ways. It's interesting. I'm learning a lot about myself. Your book was pretty impactful on me. Just want you to know that.
Yeah, Mark, I was saying to you before we started recording that I was really happy to hear that, because so many of my readers have been women. Probably 90% of my early readers were women, because it's a mother-daughter story. And so I love that it touched you, from a male perspective.
See, I don't look at it. I look at it as
human.
That's
human
why.
Beings.
Well, but it's human. It's relationships. That's why I started this show with the analogy that life is about relationships, and it has nothing to do with gender. In some, it does, but it doesn't. And as you're reading the book, that's why I want all of our listening audience, if you're a male out there and you're considering reading this book, read it, because it's going to open up, life. It's going to open up your relationships, because life is about relationships.
One of the things I teach my writing students is, you want to get at the story underneath the story. And I think, the feedback I've gotten about this story is that I really dug deep to be very honest. and not to just sugarcoat anything, and to really tell it like it is. And that means there's, pathos, there's humor. People will laugh when they read this, they'll cry when they read it. And I didn't pull any punches. I didn't hold back from telling some of the more difficult moments, some things that I did that I am not proud of, I could be ashamed of. I don't feel that way, but, I really told it all because I think, I remember an interview one time with Cheryl Strayed, who wrote the book Wild. And this was at a writers' conference, so she was talking to a room full of writers. And there's a scene in that book where her mother has died and she's been cremated. And Cheryl takes her finger and sticks it in the ashes and tastes them. And she talked about that, and she said she almost didn't put that in the book. She thought it was just like way over the line, like way too extreme to reveal something like that, and that people would judge her for it. But she ultimately decided to keep that in. And she said, after the book came out, that one section, she got more feedback from readers than anything else in the book. That thank you for telling the truth. I thought I was the only person who ever, did anything like that. Or, so I believe in telling the truth. As much of it as you could find. And, at different stages as a writer, you have different capacities to touch more of the truth.
Yeah. And telling the truth opens up the truth for me as the reader, because I think we're all in denial of our relationships to some extent. And by you exposing yourself and opening yourself up to us, the readers, I began to look at so I'm going to rename your book. I'm calling it Cracked Pot Vessels. Okay, that's who we are. We're all cracked. And I didn't notice that until you brought it up on the cover of your book. So our listening audience, when you get the book, look at the cover. And I just love that Japanese illustration that you gave of the gold that they use to bring two pieces together. And that's the essence of your story, and that's the essence of relationships. Because it's just a matter of time before we offend each other. And it's a story of reconciliation. I love it.
Yeah.
I think you nailed it. It's cracked pot vessels. That's who we are. we're and the courage that it took for you and the consistency. That's what this is over a 57-year period where you kept at it in opening yourself up to a relationship with your mom that had wronged you. And she, in turn, was doing the same thing, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What kept the two of you going?
I wish I knew that, but I really felt like we had, and now I'm going to sound like, I live in Santa Cruz, California, and I'm going to sound like someone from Santa Cruz, California, but because I don't really think this way usually. I'm a pretty down-to-earth, I'm a very down-to-earth, practical person, but I really felt like this relationship was meant to be, and that it in some ways predated who we were together, that there was some very strong, compelling energy keeping us bound to each other. And I don't mean it in an unhealthy way. I think just in a very real way, we were meant to work this out with each other. And I know that having gone through what I went through with my mother and having to really stretch way beyond what I thought I was capable of doing to care for her for the last was 6 or 7 years of her life, that I came out of it much more able to love. That it wasn't just that I had to open my heart to her, that in doing so, it helped my own evolution. It made me more capable, definitely of compassion, but also just of love and risk-taking. So, for me, even though it was an incredibly difficult journey, it was a very healing one. And I think it's available. It's like whatever we go the deepest into is going to transform us. And for whatever reason, one of the deepest aspects of my life has been this relationship with my mother. And I explored it and worked on it as fully as a human being possibly can. and the result was I was able to be there for her at the end of her life. And I was able to, when she died, I really felt like finished. I didn't have any feeling of something unresolved.
Yeah.
All that was unresolved was telling the story.
And that was part of the healing process for you, was maintaining that. But being there for your mother as a daughter is one thing. But then being there as a caregiver and a daughter, that's two different things. Talk a little bit about what it was like to be her caregiver.
Well, I want to tell your audience that my mother never lived in my house. I was rarely her physical caregiver. I supervised her care, but she lived independently. She lived in assisted living. She ended up in different rehabs and things. And she ended up living and dying in a tiny little assisted living house right around the corner from where I live. So I knew that I could not handle the intimacy of being her hands-on caregiver. And, because of the privilege of my situation, my mother, she grew up very, very poor, but by the time she, got old, she had been so frugal all her life that she had, accumulated enough money to pay for her own care at the end of her life. So, that made things a lot easier for me. And I wasn't put in a position of being forced to take her into my home, which is the situation millions of people are in. So, for me, I had to continue to have a certain boundary because I knew I also had 2 teenage children at the time. It just was, and I was running a full-on business. And I knew that I wasn't cut out to be a full-time caregiver. So I wasn't.
Yeah.
And I was able to make that choice. But
you
I
didn't.
was.
But you were. That's the thing, is sometimes
I was. I was always thinking about her.
Yeah,
morning,
absolutely.
noon, and night. She became. I always said it was like we grew another umbilical cord between us because the first one had been shattered by the estrangement and all the rage and everything that had passed between us. And I felt like here I was in my 50s growing this new umbilical cord with my mother, and that not my wife, not my children, had suddenly become again the most important person in my life for that period of years. I mean, she was the one I woke up thinking about. She was the one I went to bed thinking about. What I brought to that relationship, I think we bring whatever skills we have into the caregiving situation. And for me, I'm a researcher, so I did tons of research on her behalf. I'm very good at gathering resources. So I found the right support group. I got us in this early stage memory loss support group at the Alzheimer's Foundation. I found a book online that was called How to Move Your Parent with Alzheimer's Disease, so that I could, when I had to move her from place to place, I could do it the best way possible. I found resources to really try to do things the best I could for her, and I'm a community connector. So she was really connected in the community. So there were certain things I brought to bear because of my strengths as a caregiver. And I feel like that's what I offered her. And yet at the end of her life, when it was really clear that she was just going downhill, I realized I had to surrender my caregiving crusade, and I at the very end, it was like, okay, now I just have to love her because there's really nothing I could do. I can't save her. I can't fix this. This is going only in one direction, and it's towards her decline and her death. And now I just have to show up as her daughter.
Yeah.
And that was a very
and sound advice for our listening audience.
Yeah. Also, I was in the position of making all the decisions for her, and I write a lot about that because, I think I really wanted to try to keep her out of the hospital, for instance, because I think the hospital is like the worst place in the world for a frail old person with dementia who's already confused. And then, there's the whole system she'd fall, and then she'd have to go to the hospital. And it would just, every time she was put in that kind of situation, she would just go downhill so much. So I really was faced with a lot of decisions about, because I was the power of attorney. I was the one making these decisions. She was no longer able to make decisions on her own behalf, and I knew what she wanted. She always said to me, "Lori, I want to quit while I'm ahead." That was one of the things she always said. And she said, I remember at one point she said, "I've passed the acceptable age for death. No one would consider my death a tragedy." So at one point I called in the palliative care team because I didn't want to force her to go through all these procedures when really she had already signed a do not resuscitate order. She didn't want to be saved over. She did not want to live a life that didn't have quality. And yet, one of the things I also wrote about a lot is that the decision she made at one point in her life, actually, there's something I would love to read, if I could find it, about this exact subject of how do you make these decisions when you're dealing with a parent who is incapacitated. So I just want to read a few paragraphs about that. Okay, so at this point, she's in a acute care facility because she has broken her hip, and I have to decide where she's going to go after she can no longer be in this facility. And I just wanted to read these few paragraphs because I think this is what so many people face when they're in the position of being the caregiver. "I knew Mom was living at Kindred on borrowed time. Medicare would pay for 10 hours of therapy a week as long as the patient made progress. But if Mom refused physical therapy and couldn't follow basic commands, she couldn't stay. I didn't know if any of the places I'd researched would take her. Mom was a fall risk, and her dementia was getting worse. I didn't want to put her in a nursing home and couldn't imagine bringing her home to live with us. The last time I'd moved her, Mom's decline had been swift and precipitous. What would happen this time? I was the decider, the one who would be called to enforce the papers Mom had signed years before, the ones that said no to extraordinary measures, that insisted, do not sustain my life when I no longer have a life. I'd been with her when her doctor went through her options and made sure she understood them. But the mother I had now wasn't the mother who'd signed those papers. That mother would have been horrified to use a bedpan, but the mother I had now wasn't horrified in the least. Her mantra was no longer, just take me out back and shoot me. It was, I hope you have an old age just like mine. So I grappled with the essential question, what makes a meaningful life? I'd soon be attending a care conference with the staff at Kindred to discuss my mother's case. They were going to ask me what I wanted for her. Did I want them to try to make her walk again so she could return to her shiny red walker? She'd fallen 6 times in the past year. If she stood, she was certain to fall again. I didn't want her to break another hip, to be rushed to the hospital, bewildered and in pain. 20 years ago, a broken hip meant death, but no more. Mom was happy now, but if I aggressively treated her, would I be consigning her to round after round of hospital admissions, each with diminishing returns? Maybe it was time to arrange for palliative care rather than pushing for recovery. For years, Mom had told me, I've passed the acceptable age for death. No one would call my death a tragedy. I want to quit while I'm ahead. And so I wrestled with the question, how do I honor her wishes now?
Great question that we're all going to face at some point.
Yeah.
When do you let go? And not in the sense of let go in the sense of, not caring about that individual, but letting go and letting nature, letting death take its course, the life cycle take its course. And so many people try to hang on too long. And thank you for giving that gift to your mom.
Yeah, I've at this stage in my life, I've witnessed, some deaths, and some of them have been medically managed in the hospital to the last moment with no quality of life, with no quality of connection between the family members and the person who was dying. And I just swore I never wanted that for myself, and I didn't want it for anyone I loved.
Yeah.
I wanted a situation, I really wanted home births for my children. And I actually one, I ended up going to the hospital. The other one, I did have a home birth. So, I think I'm of the orientation of the least intervention possible, in the homiest possible setting. And I guess I believe in that for birth as well as for death.
Yeah. It's interesting that you chose the analogy of an umbilical cord. And I was quickly reminded of how the book started. You connected to your mom's umbilical cord.
Yeah.
At
definitely.
birth and you were 2 pounds.
Yeah, 2 pounds, 12 ounces.
I can't even imagine.
And that was 65 years ago. And preemies that small did not survive at that. I was really an amazing survivor.
Yeah.
It sort of imprinted me as a survivor for the rest of my life, which is definitely something that I have continued to be.
Mm-hmm. I saw that theme throughout the book. You were a survivor.
Yeah.
Which you strive. You strive to live. And in that striving, the process of reconciliation with the most important relationship in your life was, at the time, your mom. And that gave you, I think that's going to give you a quality of life for the rest of your life, your days on this earth.
I hope so. I hope you're right, Mark.
I think so. Yeah, I've seen it over and over again. We're in the in-home care business as well, keeping mom and dad safe, independent in their own home. And it's, I think it's what we all want. To end our lives, to end the chapters, because it's a series of chapters that we're all writing, and we're the authors. We hold the pen, and we're the authors of our own story. Even till the very end, when you take your last breath. That's what we want our patients and our clients to know, that they're still the author, and they get to age on their terms. And what an honor, what a gift that you can give to another human being, which you did. Great, great story of reconciliation. And that's what the book, The Burning Light of Two Stars. It's a mother-daughter story. Laura, tell our listening audience how they can get a hold of the book, and are you available if there's somebody in our listening audience that wants to reach out to you? Is that something that's possible? Do you have a website and all that?
Yeah, the book is available wherever books are sold. It's a paperback. It's an audiobook. I recorded the audiobook myself, so you could hear if you like hearing an author read their book. And it's also an ebook, so you could download it on your Kindle or whatever. So it's available wherever you want to buy books. On my website, I have posted the first 5 chapters of the book, which is a lot more than a typical like Amazon sample. So if you'd like to check it out and read the opening 5 chapters, you can do so. And that's at lauradavis.net/chapters. And then at the end of that, there's links to all the different places you could buy the book. The best place for people to reach me is on my website, lauradavis.net. You could learn about this book. You could learn about my prior books. You could learn about my writing classes and workshops. And I would love to hear from anyone listening today.
Is there anything else that you want to leave our listening audience with that we didn't? I mean, there's so much to cover, and I wish we had another 3 hours to talk about your journey in life. A fascinating story, and one that I think everybody's going to relate to. Is there something else that we missed that really needs to be told?
the only thing is just that if you had told me when I was, 28 years old and my mother and I were absolutely at war and she was my enemy, who had betrayed me to the core, if you had ever told me that I would be caring for her at the end of her life, that I would be at her deathbed, I would have looked at you like you were absolutely insane. So I think the thing I want to say is that we really never know how things are going to turn out. And, even if there's someone in your life that, where for whatever reason you really can't establish a relationship with them, maybe they're violent, or they're mentally ill, or they're incredibly hostile, or they've completely shut the door on you. What I like to say to people is, you can close the door, but leave the porch light on. Because really, until both people have passed, you never know. And even sometimes, after someone has died, people are able to achieve a lot of reconciliation with that person. It's happening on the inside. It's not going to be directly with that person. But even then, a lot of healing is possible. So I think that's what I want to leave people with, is that there are many, many roads to finding peace with a relationship that has troubled you. And it's not always going to look like, a scene in a movie where the violins are playing and everything is reconciled and rectified. But there are ways to find peace that might surprise you.
Yeah. And you're certainly, one of the things I really appreciated about the way you ended your book, you said that this may not be the best road traveled the way you handled it. There's 4 ways that you can approach reconciliation with an estranged loved one. And
right. I
love the way you ended that. And I don't know if you have time. Do you want to just quickly go over those four ways? And just because, a lot of times the guilt and the pressure to reconcile past relationships that were really hostile, or you're not saying that all relationships need to be restored like yours was.
No, I don't think that's always a good thing, because sometimes, separation from someone who is abusive is absolutely the best thing that could happen. I mean, it's really essential. And sometimes the best thing is to walk away and to create a real boundary with that person. And so reconciliation is not for everyone. But yeah, there are, I wrote a whole other book about reconciliation about 20 years ago called I Thought We'd Never Speak Again. And it's much more of a how-to. This new book is a memoir. It's a story. That book was really how to reconcile. And I interviewed tons of people and families. I interviewed people who had done restorative justice. I interviewed Vietnam veterans who went back to Vietnam, all kinds of circumstances where people who either personally or on a global level would have considered themselves enemies, but found ways to connect. And I talked about, that's where I developed this idea of these 4 different types of reconciliation. And, you could read much more about it in that book, which you could also find on my website. But, basically the first is the kind that we long for, which is what you would see in a movie where everything is out on the table. Everything is acknowledged. One person, apologizes. The other person accepts the apology. The relationship moves on either with renewed intimacy or intimacy for the first time ever. And, although that does happen, it's actually pretty rare. And it's not something that you can make happen. If it happens, it's an incredible gift for that kind of deep healing to take place between people. Then there's the agree to disagree, which is one of the things my mother did, and I did, which is that there was this huge issue between us that couldn't be reconciled. And in our case, it was, I said her father sexually abused me. She said it didn't happen. Today it could be, I think the election was legitimate and I think the election wasn't legitimate. It could be there are huge issues now that are keeping people apart in families. And sometimes you just agree that you're going to disagree about that. You stop trying to think that you could change the other person's mind. And you see, are there any threads of connection that you still want? There was a woman I interviewed that I just adored many years ago. And she was also a survivor of sexual abuse. Her father had been a brutal alcoholic. He had sexually abused, I think there were 5 or 6 children in the family. He had abused them all, the girls and the boys. And for her, the abuse went all the way until she was 18 and left home. And she was the only person in the family who ever spoke out about it. And as a result, she was cast out of the family and had no contact with them for, I think, over 20 years. And many years later, after she'd already done, a huge amount of healing herself and had moved on from the trauma of her childhood, she started to think about her mother, and her mother was getting much older and really wanting to see if there was any way to connect. And what she said was that her mother was really into the Bible, and all the women in their family loved to do handwork, like needlepoint and knitting and different things like that. And she said she bought a sampler of her mother's favorite psalm, and every day for 6 months she would sit down, and I think she was doing embroidery, and she would embroider that sampler. And as she did it, she said, I put love and compassion into every stitch. And when she finished making this sampler, she mailed it to her mother as a gift. And months later, she went for like her first visit in decades to her mother's house. And there was that sampler framed on the wall. And she said her sister, who she also hadn't spoken to in decades, every time she walked into one room, her sister would leave the room and vice versa. So they were never in the same room. And she said finally she just sat down in the room where that sampler was on the wall, and she took out her needlework. And this is the woman I interviewed, and Pauline was her name, and she just started doing her needlework. And her sister walked in the same room and took out her knitting, and she started knitting. And they were just kind of sitting side by side. And the sister looked up and looked at the sampler and said, "That's very nice." And Pauline said, "Thank you." And then they just started knitting, and then they started talking. And then over the next 10 years, because of that connection of this thing they both love to do, they started to heal their relationship. And she said she and her sister are very close now. I was so touched by that story of just finding a way in without needing anything. So, and then, another type of reconciliation is, where let's say the family is, there's just like no way for a relationship to be healed, but everyone wants to go to a wedding, the same wedding. And sometimes you could have, a really skilled therapist or mediator sit down with the family members and basically negotiate rules of engagement. So, it might be that one person says, I don't want to sit at the family table, or I'm not posing for any photographs with dad. And that each person can say what will make the gathering work for them. And if you could get people to agree to that, it's not like there's going to be any intimacy or closeness, but it can make a functional situation so everyone can come to that same event together. So that's not the kind of reconciliation maybe you want, but sometimes it could be very handy to be able to achieve that. And the last is what I had mentioned before, which is sometimes the only reconciliation possible is really from afar. So it's much more of like an internal job, internal healing, on the inside being able to send, to feel forgiveness, to send loving kindness energy, to see the bigger story of that person's life than you've been able to see before, and to reconcile on the inside so that you're not carrying that kind of burden of, anger and rage and resentment. And that's the final kind of reconciliation really is where no relationship actually is possible with the other person, but you could get to a place of real spaciousness on the inside. And that too can bring peace. And I think that's what we want. The opposite of estrangement is not reconciliation, it's peace. And so that's what we want. We want to get to a place of peace with these relationships. So they're not just, burning a hole inside of us. I know how that feels. It feels awful.
Yeah. Well said. Our guest today, Laura Davis, best-selling author, and the book that we're discussing, her memoirs, The Burning Light of Two Stars, a mother-daughter story. Laura, what a delight. Thank you so much for being on Aging Today.
I've so much enjoyed this conversation. You're so easy to talk to. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, so are you. And maybe it's because we came from the the same era. But the 50s were and the 60s were amazing times in this country. Yeah. And I hate to see it unravel like it is, but, it'll all come out in the wash in the end, I guess. Let's just hope that we can all keep it together. And it's about reconciliation. It's about finding in this country and the world peace, just like you said. Well said. All right. Well, thanks again, Laura. Appreciate you coming. And one more thing before we take off. Tell our listening audience how they can get a hold of you and how they can get the book. Let's finish with that.
Yes. The book is available anywhere books are sold, both in audiobook, paperback, and ebook. You can read the first 5 chapters for free on my website at lauradavis.net/chapters. And my website, lauradavis.net, is the best place to reach me in terms of my classes, my writing workshops, my other books, and learning more about this book. So lauradavis.net. You'll find my social media links there as well if you prefer to connect that way. And look forward to hearing from you.
All right. Thank you very much, Laura. I also want to thank our show sponsor, Comfort Care Home Care of West Linn, Oregon. The Comfort Care team at West Linn is devoted to assisting you to live your best life possible. This is Mark Turnbull, your host. Thank you for tuning in to Aging Today, the podcast where together we explore together the options to aging on your terms. Join us again next week for another lively discussion on Aging Today. And our guest next week will be Candace Smith. Remember, we're all in the process of aging. And as we age, we really are better together. So stay young at heart.
You make me feel so young. You make me feel like spring has sprung. And every time I see your face, I'm such a happy individual the moment that you speak. I want to go play hide and seek. I want to go and bounce the moon just like a toy balloon. Well, you and I are just like a couple of tots running across the meadow, picking up lots of forget-me-nots. So you made me feel so young. You made me feel there are songs to be sung, bells to be rung, and a wonderful fling to be flung. And even when I'm old and gray.
You've been listening to Aging Today, where together we explore the options to aging on your terms. Join Mark and his guest next week for another lively discussion on proactively aging on your terms, connecting you to the professional advice of his special guests, with the goal of creating better days throughout the aging process. Your host has been Mark Turnbull. Join Mark and his guests every week on Aging Today, your podcast to exploring your options for aging on your terms.
And even when I'm old and gray, you make me feel the way I feel today. 'Cause you make me feel so. You make me feel so. You make me feel so young. So young. You make me feel so young. You make me feel so young.